Okay, good morning. It's 8 o'clock, so we'll go and get started. The video for this week is actually going to be fairly short. The material in the class for this week is really just about how to do while loops and do while loops. And really, they're extremely similar to the if statements that we did in the previous week. Just with an if statement, you check a condition, you see if a condition is true or false. If the condition is true, then you execute some block of code. If it's false, then you skip over the block of code and then you go on about the rest of the program. That's kind of how an if statement works. In a while statement, you use that if you want to execute the same piece of code multiple times. So with a while statement, you will check, is a condition true or false? If a condition is true, you will execute a block of code. Then you will check the condition again. If the condition is still true, you will execute the block of code again. Then you will check the condition again, repeatedly. This is why it's called a loop, because you'll execute some code and you'll check a condition. And then as long as that condition is true, then you'll execute the same piece of code over and over again. So let's kind of see that in action. First, we'll do just kind of a recap of what the if statement is, because a while loop is very similar to an if statement. So let's first look at an if statement. So let's say we start off with the variable x and set it equal to 10. Okay. We can make an if statement. If x is equal to 10, then let's just print something out. System.out.println. The variable is, and then we'll print out the variable. Actually, instead of just saying it 10, let's have the user type in a number. So we'll make a scanner from the keyboard. And we've got a new scanner. Create a scanner. Making comments is always useful. Now we're going to get input from the user. So we'll tell the user system.out.println, enter a number, and we'll say x is equal to what they type in, right? All this you've already seen before, right? But now we want to use an if statement based on that input. We want to do something or not do something, right? So we'll say check, we'll just say as a comment, check the value. So we're just going to say if x is equal to 10, then say the variable is x. Else, actually, this is a good opportunity to make like a guessing game. So you know the old guessing games where I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 10, and then somebody has to guess what the number is, right? Let's kind of play that game with our example. So let's say the number is 3. We want them to guess the number 3, right? But the user doesn't know that yet. The user just knows that you want to enter a number. So then we'll have the user type in a number. So if what they type in is 3, that's the number I want them to guess. Then we're going to say, you guess the correct number. Else, if they don't guess it correctly, println, you didn't guess the number, right? Pretty easy, right? So we make a scanner to read input. We tell the user to enter a number. We read that number from the keyboard. If the number is 3, if they guess a number 3, then we're going to say, hey, you guessed the correct number. Else, meaning this is false, else you didn't guess the correct number, right? This is stuff that you should have picked up and learned last week, and kind of things that were part of your assignment. Let's run it. Of course, enter a number. If we enter 5, you didn't guess the number, right? Let's run it again. Guess 1. You didn't guess the number. Okay. 6. You didn't guess the number. Let's keep going until we get it right. 10. You didn't guess the number. Let's run it again. 3. You guessed the correct number. So, that's how we use if statements. We every time we ran the program, we asked the user to put in a number, and then we check it with this if statement. Kind of a rehash from last week. The reason why we did that is because a while statement is very similar to what an if statement is. So if you see what I did here, every time I wanted to guess a new number, I had to run the program again, right? Because after it checks whether you got the number right or not, it's the end of the program, right? So, if I run the program, if I answer a wrong guess, it tells me I didn't guess it. Now I have to run the program again. I guessed it wrong. I have to run the program again. I got it right this time. So I had to actually execute the program multiple times to allow me the multiple guesses. Well, shouldn't there be a way that instead of just having to run the program over and over and over, that the same program, it should just keep executing itself until you get the right number? Well, that's why we have loops. And the first one we'll talk about is the while loop. So what does the while loop look like? Say while this is pseudocode, we'll fill out the details. While something is true, execute this code. And as much code as we want to put in here, right? It'll execute this code. So what happens here, this stuff didn't change, but now we're going to say while something is true, just like with the if statement, down here with our if statement, we said if X is equal to 3, that's either true or false. The same thing with a while statement. We're going to see if something is true or false. So if this condition is true, then we will execute all of this code. At the end, we'll go back up here and we'll check it again. And that's how it's different from an if statement. With an if statement, you check this one time, and then you execute code or not, and then you go on about the rest of the program. With a while loop, you check the condition. If it is true, you execute all this code, and then you come back up here and you check the condition again. The second time, if it is still true, you execute the code again. Then you come back up here, you check the condition again. If the condition is still true, you execute the code again. You come back up here to the loop. You check the condition again. If the condition is false, if it is false, then you skip the rest of the loop, and then you just go on about the rest of the program. So let's see how to do our number guessing game with a while loop, so that I only have to execute the program one time, but it will keep asking me to input a number until I get it right. So we'll say loop until the number is guessed correctly. All right. So what do I want to put here for my condition? Well, the number they typed in is X. We say X equal to, let's say 7. Let's say 7 is the number we want them to guess right now. So this is actually we want it to be while it does not equal 7, meaning if their input is not 7, let's tell them you got the wrong number. You got the wrong number. All right. Let's delete the rest of the if statement. So whatever they type in, while the X is not 7. Remember, 7 is just a number I picked out. That's the number I want them to guess. So while their guess does not equal to 7, actually, let's name this more appropriately. Guess, we'll call the variable guess. So we know this is the number that the user is trying to guess. Okay, so if they guess it wrong, so if it is not 7, we're going to print out you got the wrong number. And then let's ask them to print it, to type it in again. So what will happen here, they'll type in their number. Let's say they type in a 6. Let's say they guess a 6. We'll get here to the while loop. We'll say, okay, 6 not equal to 7. That is true. So since it's true, we're going to execute all this code. We'll print out, you got the number wrong. We'll print out, enter a number because we want to let them try again. And then we get that new guess from the keyboard. Since that is the end of this block of code, the block of code is designated by, the curly braces here. So this was true. We execute this code. Now we go back to the loop again and we check this again. Let's say here, let's say they type in a 5 this time. Okay, so guess is now 5. We come back to the loop. We're going to say, okay, 5 does not equal to 7. That is true. So since it's still true, we execute this code again. We tell them it's a wrong number. We ask them to enter a number, and then we read the number from the keyboard. Let's say they type in a 1. Okay, we come back up. It's the end of the loop. We come back up here. So guess is now 1. 1 does not equal to 7. That is still true. So we execute this code again. Print out, it's the wrong number. Print out, enter a number, and then we get their new guess from the keyboard. Let's say this time they finally type in a 7. So they type in a 7. We come back up here. Guess is 7. So we say 7 does not equal 7. That is now false. So since it is false, it skips the loop and just goes to the next line of code. And so with the next line of code, we're going to tell them you guessed it correctly. So let's run this and make sure it works. And then we'll give it another explanation. All right. So enter a number. So right now we made the scanner. Right now we printed out this number. So right now my program is right here, waiting for me to type in a number. Let's type in a 1. It says you got the wrong number. And why is that? Because I typed in a 1. 1 does not equal to 7. So it printed out you got the number wrong, which is exactly what we have. It printed out enter a number, which is what it's done. And now it's waiting for me to guess again. Let's guess a 5. You got the wrong number. Why? Because I typed in a 5. So it goes back up here to the loop. 5 does not equal 7. That's true. Okay, let's print out the wrong number, which it did. Print out enter a number, which it did. And now it's waiting for me to type in another number. This time, let's get it right. Let's type in a 7. And it says you guessed it correctly, and the program ends. And why is that? Because here I typed in a 7. It goes back to the top of the loop. 7 does not equal to 7. That's false. So it skips the loop and goes to the next line of code, which says you guessed it correctly. And that's exactly what happened. After I entered the number 7, it doesn't ask me to enter it again because it skipped the loop. And it just went directly to the next line of code, which printed out you guessed it correctly. Notice that there is no else statement for a while. You can't do that. With an if statement, you can. There is an if else. But for a while, there is no else statement. A while just lets you execute the same piece of code over and over and over until your condition is false. So for our condition, we're just going to say if the guess does not equal to 7. Okay, but let's change it up a little bit. Instead of enter a number, enter a name. So instead of get an integer, it'll be a string. Guess. Instead of integer, it'll be next. Just get the whole string. And so we can't compare it to a number anymore, right? Because guess is a string. So say if your guess equals this lowercase Dan, it's another way to look at it. This is just an IDE thing. I don't like it highlighting that. Okay. You don't have a cool name. Enter a name and guess. We'll explain it here in a second. There we go. This is the same exact concept we went through with the numbers, except this time we're just going to use a string. So again, we create a scanner. We're going to tell the user to put your name in. Then we're going to let them type in their name. Now we're going to say if their name, we're going to compare their name to Dan. If it is not Dan, that's what this is doing. If their guess, we're checking if the guess is equal to Dan. And we're saying are they false, meaning they don't match. If these strings do not match, we're going to say you don't have a cool name. And then we're going to ask you to put in your name again, and then we'll get the guess again, and then it'll repeat, just like with the number. However, if the string does equal Dan, then we're going to skip the loop and we'll go down here, tell you have a cool name. Let's run it. Probably won't talk too much more about that because it's the exact same thing as guessing a number. We're just doing it with a string. So enter name, Joe. You don't have a cool name. Susie, you don't have a cool name. I'm not going to choose anybody's name in the class. Don't want to do that to you. Bob, you don't have a cool name. Dan, you have a cool name. So that's how this while loop lets us execute code over and over and over until a condition is met or a condition is false, and then it'll exit out of the loop. One more example with a while loop. Actually, let's show the do while loop, and then we'll do one more example. So we have this while loop. While you check the condition, if the condition is true, you execute the code, right? There's another variation. I will admit it is used much more rarely, but it does exist. So that's the while loop. There's also what we call the do while loop. I was putting it down. Actually, let me change it up here. So that's the while loop. We'll leave it in there for a second. There's also the do while loop. The only difference in them is when the condition is checked. So here with a while loop, we first check the condition. We check if this is true or false, and then we execute code or not. So the while loop checks the condition first. With a do while loop, execute this code. With a do while loop, it will execute the code and then check the condition. So it's just a little bit backwards in when it checks the condition. As I said, a while loop, it first checks the condition. If the condition is true, it does all this stuff. With a while loop, it does all the code first. It executes all the code first, and then it checks the condition. If the condition is true, it goes back to the top of the loop and executes the code again. After it executes the code, it again checks the condition. If it's still true, it goes back up here and executes the code. Then it checks the condition. If the condition is false, then it stops doing the loop and then just goes to the next line of code in the program. So that's the difference between a while loop and a do while loop. While loop checks the condition first. A do while loop checks the condition after you execute the code. So when it is, like I said, this one is much more rare. It is there and it is used, but when is it useful? And it's actually more useful in our current program to use a do while loop. And why is that? I think I've mentioned it before in this course, maybe not in this course yet. I think we haven't gotten to that yet. But in any programming language, a duplication of code is generally a sign that you're doing something less than efficiently in your program. If you see yourself doing the same piece of code multiple times, it's probably a good indication that you should use a loop somehow to remove that duplicate code. And what is the duplicate code we have here? Let's delete this out for a second. If we still just have our while loop, what's the duplicate code? Well, our duplicate code is right here. We're telling them to enter a name. Then if it's the wrong name, we're doing the same exact thing. You see this right here, this piece of code right here, printing out enter a name and then letting them type it in. It's the exact same piece of code here. And we have to do that with a while loop because we have to let them guess a name before we can check our condition. Right? And so we need to figure out how to get rid of this duplicate code. And we can actually get rid of it with a do while loop. And let's look at that. So let's have a variable for name. Say string name is equal to a blank string. So now instead of a while loop, let's use a do while loop. Do something while name dot ignore case Dan equals false. What have I done wrong here? Wow. Oh, name. Yes. What about? I think I'm doing something wrong. Name. Compare. Oh, I put compare. Equals ignore case. There we go. And it's just highlighting it because my IDE is trying to be smarter than it thinks it is. All right, so now with a do while loop, so inside the loop, we can ask them to enter their name. Enter your name. We'll say now the name is equal to whatever they type in, and there we go. System.out.println. You got a cool name. Just a little bit different way to do it. So as you can see here, I've gotten rid of that duplicate code, right? Because I want to do something and then I checked kind of whether it was successful or not. Here, I'm doing something, I'm checking if it's successful or not, and then I'm doing the thing again with multiple lines of code. Here, I've kind of eliminated, there we have that duplicate code. I've eliminated that duplicate code by, as part of my loop, I'm going to ask for their input, and then I'll say, basically, is that input correct or not? Let's run it. So enter a name, Joe, enter a name, Bob, enter a name, Alice, enter a name, Dan. You got a cool name. Whoops. And actually it's telling me to enter a name again because it's came down here to the rest of the code. Let's just end our program so we don't see that extra printout. Just so you can see it doesn't go down there and execute it. There we go, their name, Joe, Bob, Bill, Dan. You got a cool name, and that's the end of the program. So that's kind of a use case for the do while loop. Like I said, do while is much more, excuse me. A do while loop is much more rare than just a standard while loop, but it does exist. And that is all of the new material for this week. So when we look at your assignment, we'll talk a little bit about the assignment. Let's get rid of all this stuff. We'll keep our scanner on there. So with your assignment, you have to get some input from the user. You have to do some kind of math with that input. Then you display the results of your calculations. And then you need to ask them, do they want to keep, do they want to do it again? You know, do they want to do the calculation again? So your assignment is something like get input from the user, calculate the output, display the output. See, ask if the user wants to do it again, and repeat if they say yes. That's kind of what you have to do for your assignment. So when I say repeat if they say yes, repeat there is kind of the key word that you should use a loop. So let's do a loop. And then all of this stuff, you know, is kind of going to be part of that loop. Oops. You know, that's kind of it in comments and pseudocode, kind of what you need to do, right? Obviously, loop isn't a word, isn't a Java word, you know, it's a while loop condition. Or you can do a do while loop, you know, however you want to tackle the problem. There is no wrong way. You can use a while loop or you can use a do while loop. As long as you make it work, you can use either one that you want. But in pseudocode or in comments, really, that's really what you're trying to do, right? So you want to do a loop. Inside the loop, you're going to get input from the user. You're going to calculate the output. You want to display the output. Then you want to ask if the user wants to do it again. And if the user says yes, you want to do the loop again. After you do the loop again, you'll ask them again, do you want to do it again? If they say yes, do the loop again. If they say no, then do not repeat the loop and just go to the next line of code. So repeat if they so actually the user wants to do it again. If user says no, then go to next line of code. There we go. That's a more complete example. So that's kind of what you need to do for your assignment. And of course, I'm not going to type that in for you right now. You can, you know, rewatch this video and go back a little bit to see the examples I did of the while loop and the do while loop. How, you know, earlier I was letting the user type in a name, right? If the name was Dan, then we just went to the next line of code. If the username was not Dan, then I did the loop again, right? That's kind of what this part is. Ask if the user wants to do it again. This is equivalent to what I was saying earlier. Ask the user their name. If the username was not Dan, then I repeated the loop. If the username was Dan, I went to the next line of code. So with that in mind, you can look at the earlier portion of the video and kind of adapt that loop to meet what you have to do here for your assignment. And that is really all the new material for this week, is really just this while loop and this do while loop. There are some other types of loops, which we will get into next week, but that's the only ones for this week. So I am ready for any questions you may have.
So I have a question. I've been having trouble with my last assignments, like kind of making a range for my loop or my if or while statement. And I was just trying to see like how would I format that? Is that the same way as we did today in today's example, or is it another way?
When you say range, do you mean like if a number is within a certain range of numbers?
Yes.
Oh, okay, yeah, I'll give you an example of that. So really it can apply to an if statement or a while statement, because in the if statement, if something is true, right? The while statement is the same thing. While if I can spell something is true. So really, what I'm getting ready to show you applies whether it's an if statement or a while statement, because this right here is the same regardless. You're just checking if something is true or not. Okay, so let's just make a quick little example here about how, let's get the user to type in a number, and then we'll tell the user if their number is in the correct range or not. Okay, so let's tell the user to type in a number. Enter a number. There we go. We'll get the number. Number is whatever they type in. Scanner.next int. So now, actually, we'll tell them enter a number from 1 to 100. Right? We're going to tell them what the range is. So if we want them to type in a number between 1 and 100, now we want to check, is that number in the correct range? We can do it like this. So if the number is less than 1, right, then that means the number is too low, right? So we'll say system.out.println number is out of range, right? We'll say the number is out of range, right? Because whatever they type in, if that number is less than the number 1, then it's too low, because we said the range is 1 to 100. Okay. So that checks if it's too low. Now let's check, is the number too high? Let's do an else if number is greater than 100. Then we will print also the number is out of range. Right? So if the number is less than 1, we'll say it's out of range. Else, that means if this was false, let's say they typed in the number 200. Well, let's say they typed in the number 0. Let's start with 0. So if they type in the number 0, then we're going to look, okay, 0 less than 1, that is true. So we will execute this. Next line of code. So if they type in a 0, 0 is less than 1. So that's true. So we'll print this out, number out of range. And then we'll skip everything else and then go to the next line of code. Okay, so let's imagine now they type in the number 200. Okay, so we'll say 200 less than 1. That is false. Since that's false, we skip this part and we go to the else. So now we're going to say else 200 greater than 100. That is true. So since it's true, we will print out the numbers out of range. Right? So how do we tell them if it is in range? We can have an else statement here. So with that else statement, there's no if part of this. Number is in range. And there's a shorter way to do that, and I'll show you in a second. I want to show you the little bit longer way first. So again, let's use the example of 0. If they type in a 0, 0 less than 1, that's true. So we execute that code. We skip all of the other else ifs and the else, and we execute the next line of code. All right. If they type in a 200, something that's too high, 200 less than 1, that's false. So we skip this and we go to the next check. Else 200 greater than 100, that is true. So we will execute that code and we skip the rest of it and go to the next line of code. So let's say they type in a 50, something that is in range. So 50 less than 1, that's false. So we go to the next check. 50 greater than 100, that is also false. So we go to the next check. And since this is just an else, there's not an if condition on it. So this will get executed. If all of the other if statements above it are false, then the else is what gets executed, and it tells me it's in range. Let's just put end of program thing here, so we know when it's the end of the program. You know, actually let's just say it's the next line of code, so that we know it got there. All right, let's run this again. This is the little bit longer way. I'll show you the short way here in a second. So let's run it. So enter a number from 1 to 100. Again, if we put 0, it tells us the number is out of range. And that's because it executed that code right there, and then it went to the next line of code. All right, let's run it again. Enter 333. The number is out of range, and then the next line of code, because, you know, that was false, but that was true. So we said the number's out of range, and then we go to the next line of code. And then, of course, if we put something that is in range, it says the number is in range. And why? Because that was false. Whenever they type in 55, that was false. And so then we just do the only else statement left, and we say it's in range, and then go to the next line of code. So let's kind of condense that down a little bit in a shorter version. So when we have this condition, we can actually have more than one condition in there. If we want two things to be true, or the easier way is if we want two things to be true. So this was checking, these if statements were checking if it's out of range. Let's check if it is in range. So we can say if the number is greater than or equal to 1, and that's what that means. When you have two ampersands, it means and. Number is less than or equal to 100. Number is in range. Else number is, and we'll explain it here in a second, out of range. Let me send the curly brace. There we go. So, you know, that's a little bit shortened version. That's because we're doing two checks at the same time. That's what the and means. The two ampersands mean and, meaning this is true and this is true. So we're saying the number must be greater than and equal to 1, and that number must be less than or equal to 100. So that's asking, is our number inside that range from 1 to 100? So the number, it must be greater than or equal to 1, and it must be less than or equal to 100. If both of those are true, then it says it's in range. If either one is false, it prints this outer range, meaning this, if this is true, but this is false, then the whole thing is false. And so it would skip that and execute that. Both things must be true in order to do this. So, for example, if we type in a 0, so if we type in a 0, 0 greater than or equal to 1, that's already false. We don't even need to do this part because this is already false. 0 greater than or equal to 1 is false. Skip this and execute the else statement, saying it's out of range. Okay, if the number is 200, if we type in a 200, it's going to say 200 greater than or equal to 1. That part is true. So we need to keep checking. And 200 less than or equal to 100. That part's false, though. When the number is 200, that is true, but that is false. And like I said, everything must be true in order for this to happen. But that's not the case when I type in a 200. When I type in a 200, that part is false, so it makes the whole thing false. And so I do my else statement. And just show you it works. If we type in a 0, it's out of range and goes to the next line. If I type in 222, numbers out of range, go to the next line of code. If I type something in between, even if I type in a 1, it's in range. If I type in a 100, the extremes, it's in range. And of course, if I put something in the middle, it's also in range. So that's how you can check if the number is in range. Do it really quickly for a while loop. So while, what's the best way to do this? Well, I'll leave the while example to you since while is part of our assignment this week. If you have if you want to do this in a while loop and you're having problems with it, email me directly. It's not really part of what we're doing for this week. But if you want to explore it, just shoot me an email and I can give you some examples of the while loop.
Alrighty, thank you.
You're welcome. Stand by for about 1 more minute or so, see if there's any lingering questions, and then we'll wrap it up. All right, nothing else heard. As I said, this week was a little bit shorter because it's the if statement stuff we did last week is extremely similar to what we're doing this week as far as the while loop. It's just, do I execute the code one time or do I keep looping through it multiple times, which is what the difference is between an if statement and a while statement. If you have any questions about the material or your assignment or need assistance, then please email me, please let me know. Many of you are asking lots of questions, and that's great. That's fine. It's part of figuring out, part of learning. But if you have problems, please reach out to me, and I'll via email. Email is the best way, and I'll help you as well as I can. Everyone have a good rest of your weekend.
Thank you. You too.